Good morning and welcome. Now, I've had some really good questions come through. One of them, which I'm going to answer online this morning. I had a question come through from Berkey, who's a long-time Dietitian approved crew member. And he wants to know how to break his beer and pizza habit. So I'm not sure I can cover that in a 20-minute live, Berkey. We need a bit more help. You might need a bit more help than 20 minutes of live, but I doubt that he'll be online this morning anyway, because he's about to race Cairns. All right, good morning everyone that's coming on Insta. Good morning, Naturally and Journey to Fitness. I can't see if there's anybody on Facebook just yet, but that's cool. So the other question I had come through, and I had a couple of people ask about it actually, is carb loading and how to do that properly. And I thought it would be a really good time to talk about it, well, because Cairns Ironman is this weekend. It's a little too late for you if you're doing Cairns though, and you need a carb loading plan, because you want to start carb loading tomorrow basically, potentially even launching in today a little bit. So it's a bit late for you if you are doing Cairns. But I guess I've been up to my eyeballs in carb loading plans lately as well. So it's kind of forefront of my mind. And I wanted to actually teach people how to do it properly, because everyone that I've spoken to recently has just sort of had no idea how to do it. They think that eating a bowl of pasta the night before is carb loading. And let me tell you that it's not. So I'm going to run you through like exactly what it is and how to do it. I'm not going to dive into the science of like deep what actually happens in the muscle and how, like what actually occurs. I'm going to try and be more practical because I find that's more useful, so that you can actually walk away with something that you can implement yourself. So if you're on Facebook, give me a holler and let me know that you're here, or pop me a comment. And yeah, there's a couple of people on Insta too. So yeah, let's talk about carb loading and what it actually is. Good morning, Lisa. So carbohydrate loading is where you actually load more carbohydrate in your muscle. So we store carbohydrate in our muscle as glycogen. It's our fuel tank, kind of like the fuel tank of a car, right? So you're putting petrol in your tank in your car to drive. So carbohydrate is your fuel, and you need to fill up your petrol tank as well. Now, our petrol tank, our glycogen fuel tank, doesn't fill up instantly like a car. You can't just put petrol in or eat carbohydrate and it's full. It does take 24 to 48 hours to fill up your glycogen fuel tank, particularly if it's relatively empty. So carbohydrate loading by just having a pasta meal the night before isn't going to be effective, because, well, one, it's on enough carbohydrate, but two, the timing of it isn't there as well. Like, you need to give the body time to pull that carbohydrate apart, break it down, and then it actually packs it up and stores it in our muscle with water in a ratio of 1:3. So you actually get a bit of extra hydration by carbohydrate loading too. So if you're storing 4 grams extra in your muscle times however many grams of carbs you're storing, you actually do gain a little bit of weight with carbohydrate loading, and that's totally normal. So don't be afraid of that. If you gain about 1 kilo, that's totally normal. And what actually happens if you do an event, it's lost in that event anyway. So you don't have to worry about jumping on the scales race morning and seeing that you're an extra kilo or so heavier. Like, that is good. That's where you want to be, because it means that your glycogen fuel tank is full. You've got a fair bit of extra hydration on board, and you want to be well hydrated heading into an event anyway too, right? So if you're a bit heavier on race morning, that's great. That's perfect. Not like 3 or 4 kilos though, that would be bad. There's a fine line. But it's lost in your event anyway, so don't stress about that. Good morning, Steve Gleason and Alicia XFiz on Insta. All right, so it's definitely not eating just a bowl of pasta the night before, which I've just explained, because it doesn't give it enough time for it to store, but it's also not enough. So when I carbohydrate load people, I'll walk you through the process that I do with people, and it's highly individual. So there's a range of carbohydrate per kilo, but depending on who you are and what sort of athlete you are, will depend how aggressive I am or not. And if Jodie jumps online, she may or may not be here. She's an example of somebody that potentially doesn't eat a lot of carbohydrate in their day-to-day training life. So aggressively carbohydrate loading her isn't going to be useful. Like, one, she's going to really struggle with the volume. And two, her body doesn't know how to process that much carbohydrate either. So it's highly, highly individual. And I will plan my carbohydrate loading plans for the person. Like, if you're a super fast athlete and you're trying to win and you're used to munching through a fair bit of carbohydrate in your day-to-day training, then I will probably load you more on the top end. But if you're maybe a slower athlete, or you're a female, or you're not used to having a whole heap of carbohydrate in your day-to-day training, or you've never done anything like it before, then I will carbohydrate load you on the lower end. And I think that's really important because you can pull shit from the internet. It's the power of the internet. Good morning, Laura Mead. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's right, or that it's right for you either. So it's highly individual. And if you want to do it, I'd suggest you do it with a sports dietitian who actually knows how to do it. So the principles of carbohydrate loading, it's useful for events that are longer than 90 minutes because that's the theory of how long your muscle glycogen stores are going to last, is around 90 minutes. And that was done in a cycling study many years ago, where they did like threshold riding and went until they hit the wall, basically. But that was quite high intensity, I would say. And so if you're going slower, your muscle glycogen is going to last you a bit longer than 90 minutes. So 90 minutes is a cutoff if you're going at the same pace as the research, but you potentially aren't. So it could last you a bit longer. If you're going even faster than the research, it might last you less too. Good morning, Alex. So like, as a rough idea, sort of events lasting longer than 90 minutes, I guess I'm an endurance sports dietitian. So most of my clients' events are minimum 2 hours, like thinking Olympic distance, triathlon, 70.3s, Ironman. I've got, crazy runners. Alana's about to do a 160K trail run at the Brisbane Trail Ultra, 100K, 100K runs, and then Emma's doing things like 24-hour mountain bike events. So I don't have like short, sharp athletes in my crew. It's all endurance stuff. So for a lot of them, carbohydrate loading is going to be key because everyone's doing events that are way longer than 90 minutes. Alex said, we're heading off to the park shortly, but thought I'd pop in and say hi. Hi, thanks for joining, Alex. What are you doing soon, Alex? You've got an event coming up. Are you doing anything at Cairns, or are you doing something different? All right, so the premise is that it's for events that last longer than 90 minutes, where you're going to be relying quite heavily on your muscle glycogen stores, so our fuel tank in our muscles. And we want to make sure that our fuel tank is full, right? So we want to try and what's called super compensate up our muscle glycogen stores. So your normal level of glycogen refill is a sort of certain threshold, and with carbohydrate loading, we're actually going to bump that up and fill it up further. So you will naturally, if you're tapering training or resting and eating carbohydrate, you'll naturally slowly fill up your glycogen fuel tank anyway. But if you really want to carb load, you need to do a much more concerted effort to do that. Good morning, Liv. Alex said she's doing a half marathon here in Mackay on Sunday. Good luck. You could potentially carb load, Alex. I think you might have an old school, like maybe circa 2016 carb loading plan. You could give it a crack if you wanted. All right, if you're on Facebook too, give me a holler and let me know that you're here, because there's a few people sneakily watching that I can't see. All right, so events longer than 90 minutes is definitely worth looking at and useful for. And the idea is that you're filling up your fuel tank to the brim and then putting extra into the top. So kind of like, I don't know if everyone does this, I do this, but you fill the fuel tank up in your car and you wait till the click and then you click it again to like shove a bit extra in. It's kind of like that. Let me know if that's you, if you do that too. Alex said, yeah, she is a bit old now. Hey, yeah, she probably needs a bit of an update if she's circa 2016. You could be eating differently now. The research hasn't changed since then, but it's always worth a shake-up. But yeah, it's 2016 was what, 5 years ago? That is crazy. 2 babies later. Hey, Alex. Okay, so carb loading, if you're doing anything longer than 90 minutes, it's worth giving it a go. And how much carbohydrate you have is dependent on who you are and what type of athlete you are. So it's based on grams per kilo of lean mass. Now, I think that's really important to understand because your lean mass, your muscle tissue weight is much lower. Well, not much lower, but it is lower than your total weight, right? So you're not carb loading for your weight when you jump on the scales. You're carb loading for the amount of you that's metabolically active tissue, and it's muscle. Like, there's no point loading the fat tissue. You can't do it. So the amount that you have depends on how much muscle you have on board. So that's really important as well. Like, particularly if you're trying to pull shit information off the internet, that it's not based on your weight, it's based on your lean mass weight, because it makes sense, right? You want to load carbohydrate into your muscle. We don't want to load carbohydrate into your fat. In fact, it's impossible. All right. So the types of foods that you eat when you're carb loading, that's really important as well. So we're aiming for a certain amount of carbohydrate, which for most of you, unless you're an elite triathlete, you're probably not eating the amount of carbohydrate in your day-to-day training that you need to be consuming to carbohydrate load. So we want to make sure it's very carb-focused meals and snacks. And to make way for that volume, I usually plan stuff that's more refined. So it's against what my normal dietitian ethos is. So, you know, it's only for a short period of time as well. It's not a long-term eating plan. And I'll often write that in my carb loading plans, is that it's not a long-term solution. It's purely for the effects of carb loading. So yeah, carbohydrate focused foods. We don't want too much fiber. We want to make sure that our gut is super clean and there's not a lot in it as you're loading. And then not eating too much fat and too much protein as well. So obviously they still need to feature. And if you're eating real foods, then they're gonna happen anyway. But you're not looking to really focus on getting those foods in. So as an example, if you're having a meal and there's carbs, protein, fat on your plate, if you're getting full and you're really struggling, then you should be focusing on eating the carbohydrate portion on that plate first, and leave a bit of the protein stuff out. So yeah, very carbohydrate focused. So as an example, like if you went to a bakery and got something from a bakery, a lot of those foods are very high carb, white bread, you know, focused, low fiber, but not things like donuts or pastries or croissants, because they're really high in fat. So we're getting the carbs, but we're getting too much fat with it. So think, as an example from the bakery, think like Vegemite scrolls or finger buns or those big cafe-style muffins, that sort of food choice on the flip side, rather than donuts and pastries and, yeah, etc. Good morning, Smiley Rachel Goodwin. Okay, so does that make sense? Any questions? There's a bunch of people online, so please ask away if there's anything, and I'll try and answer on the fly. But I guess they're the key points for carbohydrate loading, is that it is actually specific, it's planned, it's calculated, and then you, of course, want to practice it. I always get my athletes to practice it at least twice heading into an event, at least twice. I'm not comfortable, like if you asked me for a carb loading plan today for tomorrow, I would say no. I just wouldn't do it, because it is something that you do need to practice and make sure that you're comfortable with it and you're used to it. And your body also needs to learn to deal with that much carbohydrate. Like, we need to increase your carbohydrate digestion enzymes. We need to get the hormones and enzymes happening to be able to process that much carbohydrate and store it as glycogen. Like, if you don't eat carbohydrate and then you suddenly eat carbohydrate, like the high fat, low carb people, it makes no sense to me why they have a high fat diet, low carb, and then eat carbohydrate in their events, because their body doesn't know what to then do with that carbohydrate to process it. Makes absolutely no sense. So making sure you do practice it, I guess I get people to do it at least twice. And your carbohydrate loading plan will be different for different events. So you would load differently for a 70.3 to, say, an Ironman. And it's having, like, everything that is with nutrition, it's customized, it's individualized to that event and who you are, and it's well practiced as well. So I do have a question here. So would you say carbohydrate loading would be the same after a strength training workout? So you don't need to carbohydrate load for a strength training workout. So we're talking about endurance events here that last longer than 90 minutes. And a strength-based session would be much more short, sharp, high intensity type lifting with not a lot of work in it. So in a 60-minute session, there might be 10 minutes of work depending on how you train. So you don't need to carbohydrate load for strength training. But I guess if your question is about recovery, then you do want to include carbohydrate after strength training for recovery. Smiley Rach just said, kids just picked a 12-pack of donuts, better go back to Woolies. Yeah, donuts aren't the greatest. Like, yeah, they're high carb, but they're also high fat. So that fat's going to slow down the digestion and make you feel quite full and probably a bit sluggish. So I'd go for something like, if you're going to Woolies, maybe something like, there is scrolls type things or finger buns, or one of my clients is carb loading at the moment on those like ham and like pineapple roll things. I don't know what they're called. They've got little bits of ham, little bits of pineapple and stuff on the top of a bread roll. Yeah, I don't usually buy them, so I don't know what they're called, but he loves them. And so they're in his plan. And I will often write a carb loading plan with something in there that people love, okay? It's hard to carb load. Don't think it's easy, but I generally try and make people enjoy it by putting foods in there that they do love and enjoy. Alex said, we have been doing low carb, no sugar type diet, not quite perfect, but have definitely noticed when we have carbs, our guts not love it. Yeah, the body is super smart, right? If you eat high fat, low carb, it flips all the systems to burn and work better on fat, right? So it decreases your carbohydrate digestion enzymes. Whereas conversely, if you're eating high carbs all the time, then there's heaps of enzymes and hormones to then deal with that. So yeah, just whatever you're doing in your training, in your day-to-day life, don't suddenly try and do something on race day that's different. You need to kind of build your gut and yeah, get all of that stuff working effectively to then deal with it when you're under stress of exercise. Okay, I don't think I missed anything there. So what did I get up to? So any other questions, please ask me while I'm off track. And yeah, carb loading types of foods, we've talked about that. Having a plan that's for you, and I guess also having a plan that's for your event. So in the Dietitian approved recipe database, I am building out a carb loading section, and there's maybe 6 or 7 recipes in there now that are specifically for carb loading. So Alana, who's doing this 100 miler, 160K trail run, she's got access to our recipe database, and she's just going through each of those recipes and testing out what she likes, what she doesn't like, and what also feels good when she's loading before running too. So yeah, I guess the whole like cooking and practicing at home is really key. And then also thinking again, like extracting that to what you're going to do in your event. So if a lot of my athletes up in Cairns are staying in like a tiny little hotel, they've got a kettle and that's it. So we've had to really think about what they're going to have based on no access to cook stuff, and they're going to have to do a lot of eating out. But I've been really firm with directing them around like portions and exactly what to choose, how to manipulate their meals so that they can go and actually do that with confidence because they don't have the ability to cook at home. So that's also important as well, is that your plan that you're practicing and training needs to reflect what you're going to do then right before your event, particularly if you're traveling. So Alex said, how do you carb load with that? Do you just increase small amounts? And then Rachel said, love the recipe database. Rachel, you're not doing Cairns or anything, are you? Let me know if you're doing Cairns, because you have a carb loading plan. That's worth giving a crack. So how do you carb load? So you're talking about you, Alex, as in you're not having a lot of carbohydrate at the moment, and then you're trying to carb load. I'd go super conservative with you then. So I haven't looked at your plan for 5 years, so I couldn't tell you what it is or what sort of load it is. But it needs to be the minimum target though. Like you can try and just increase your carbohydrate the day before you race, but it's not loading. It's, topping up your glycogen stores, but it's not loading extra in there. So you could do that, but I'd just be careful. If you're increasing the amount of carbohydrate you have just day to day and it's affecting your guts, then I don't know if I'd play with that this close to an event, particularly because it's a running event. That's not going to end up pretty on race day. So Rach said she's doing Cairns. Are you doing the Ironman, Rach? And you are probably already up there then, I guess. So Alex said, yep, it's been a while, just in general with a low carb diet. Yes, so depends how low. Are we talking keto? Are we talking like less than 50 grams of carbs a day, Alex? This is getting deep here. This is getting deep science. But yeah, I guess if you're training on high fat keto, then you essentially don't need carbohydrate on race day. But if you're kind of dabbling around low carb, that's not necessarily low carb, then I wouldn't play with too much this close if it's on Sunday. Thinking for future events. Oh, you want to do high fat, low carb for future events? Or do you want to eat carbs for future events? That might help clarify my answer for that one. All right, and there's still a few people on Facebook. Give me a holler if you're here. Send me a comment. The little thing doesn't tell me who's actually online. All right, go Alex, type fast. It depends what you're doing it for too, Alex, right? Like if you're doing a low carb diet for body composition, then that's fine. And it might just be something that you do short term, get your body composition to where you want it to be. But if you're looking to step up to longer course stuff, then this is a whole other coffee and questions session on the low carb, high fat diet. There's not a lot of evidence for people that want to go fast for having the high fat approach. So I'll try and give you a quick summary because it's pretty deep. But if you are on a high fat diet, you lose your top end speed, right? Because you need to use glycogen, or to burn fat, you need oxygen available, right? So if you are on a high fat diet, you need oxygen available to then use that as a fuel source. And so it means your pace needs to be relatively aerobic. If you want to then try and go faster and switch into the anaerobic zone, then where we lose oxygen availability, then burning fat there is much more difficult. And that's why we draw on our muscle glycogen stores up there. So I think the high fat people, now this is highly generalized, but I've seen a lot of like older male athletes kind of trying to promote it. And that's totally fine because it probably works for them because they're very endurance trained and they would be a slower, steadier state athlete, kind of like I call them a diesel engine. They can go the same pace for hours. They can go all day like that. And they can be more suited to the high fat approach because they're not looking at going fast necessarily. Like they might have that one pace and that's it. So yeah, I don't want to go too deep into low carb, high fat right now. We can do a whole nother session on it if you want. I'm probably going to get all these haters also comment about it because there's some real like pro low carb, high fat people. And I guess just be mindful that works for them and that it may not necessarily work for you. All right, Alex says, when I'm back to work and in decent pay, I will give you a call. Okay. All right, that's way easier. We're off to the park now. We've felt great on the low carb diet, so I've just continued on with it on and off. Haha, I'm a one pace gal. Maybe you're a diesel engine. Yeah, so it depends if it's low carb or not, though, I guess. You might have just pulled the carbohydrate out of your diet a little bit. It's not necessarily keto, and that's a difference between like actually being in ketosis and using fat, like flipping the brain to use fat as a fuel source instead of carbohydrate. You could just be keeping your carbohydrate intake on the lower side, which is totally fine if that helps with your maintaining body composition. All right, too deep for me. It's too early. Coffee and questions is meant to be light. Any questions on carbohydrate loading? And then I'll start to wrap up because we're past my 20-minute cutoff. But definitely something to get a plan for if you have an event that's, you know, Olympic distance triathlon or longer, and make sure you practice it in training. You don't want to try something first time on that day. Good morning, Steph Hansen. Welcome to my live. Journey to Fitness said, great discussion. You're welcome. Any last questions, pop them in here and I'll answer them for you. Watch the replay if you've just joined. Thanks. Have a great day too. Journey to Fitness. Watch the replay if you've just joined. We've been talking about carbohydrate loading, how to do it, and I guess what it's not. It's definitely not eating just a bowl of pasta the night before. And then Steph, if you are actually online, we were talking last night about lasagna. So I've had a bunch of people want to eat lasagna for carb loading, and it's actually quite low in carbohydrate. You'd think it might be high, but there's so much more other stuff in lasagna that makes way for the carbs. So a hot tip if you want to carb load on lasagna is to double sheet it or triple sheet it, and then have it with some garlic bread on the side. Yeah. So that's what I mean. Like, carbohydrate loading foods are not what I would normally recommend to people. Like, I wouldn't normally recommend to you to have garlic bread with a meal necessarily, but carb loading, it's fine. Steph said, sorry, I wasn't here earlier. That's okay. You're welcome. Alex said, not enough coffee. Chat later. Definitely not enough coffee to talk about low carb, high fat in a PC way this morning. And then Lisa has asked, how many days before an endurance event should you start loading? Great conversation. Thanks. Yeah, good question. So it depends how long your event is. So for a shorter event, maybe just a day. Oh, Wendy's actually asked the same question over on Facebook. Hey, Taryn, how many days would you carb load for? Okay, and Wendy's asked for Noosa. So for a shorter event, say Noosa, an Olympic distance race, you could carb load for a day. But for, say, an Ironman, anywhere up to sort of 2 to 3 days. Steph said yes to garlic bread. Garlic bread's pretty much straight carbs. Like, obviously there's a bit of butter, but it's a really good high carb food and easy for people to eat. Like, if I ask people how much garlic bread they can eat, they're like, I can eat a whole loaf. Like, even females tell me that. So nice and easy to eat. And if you're adding that to a bowl of pasta or something, then that's a really high carb meal. And then Lisa's asked for a 70.3. So for a 70.3, we're stepping a bit longer than Olympic distance. So because I assume that you're a female, Lisa, by your photo, it looks like you are. And Wendy, you're a female. So females are not as great at carb loading as males. Now, there's probably a few reasons. One, our muscle levels are smaller, like we're not as much lean mass. Two, we're probably not as, this is generalized, but we're probably not as comfortable eating the volume of carbohydrate that you need to get into carbohydrate load. And three, there is some preliminary research around the hormonal cycle and your ability or effectiveness to carb load. Now, that research is quite preliminary, not enough for me to tell you yes or no. That's definitely the case, but potentially at certain phases of your cycle, when estrogen is high or low, you may be better or worse at carbohydrate loading. So that could be one of the factors why females aren't as good. So potentially for you too, Wendy and Lisa, you could even extend your carbohydrate load a little bit further. So that might be something that I'll do with female athletes, or say someone like Jodie who doesn't have a lot of carbohydrate in her day-to-day diet, is carbohydrate load her on the lower end and do it for a bit longer. So does that answer your question? Give me a holler if that's okay or not. And then Steph said, quick one, carb loading, when do you stop? And when would you smash a gel or something the morning of the race? Good one. So I guess carbohydrate loading, in my mind, you stop the night before. But then if you're doing a triathlon event, then your race is generally in the morning. Unless you're an elite athlete, then your event might be in the afternoon. But generally for the age groupers, then their event's in the morning. And so your carb loading stops at the night before, but then I plan a pre-race meal for people. And that is a kind of a continuation of the carb load, but it's your last chance to top up your muscle glycogen before you do your race. So you've just slept. It's not like you've used your muscle glycogen overnight or you're asleep, but it's one last chance to actually just make sure your fuel tank is fully topped up, your stomach is primed. It's a good opportunity to get some fluid in, potentially some caffeine, and extra things like that, some extra strategies. So the Cairns guys, I've kind of salt loaded them a little bit because it's going to be hot. Well, hotter than it is down south here. So yes, you kind of essentially, your carb loading plan for me stops at dinner or before bed the night before, but I always do a pre-event meal for people as well, Steph. And that's planned and calculated and individualized and specific, because that's how I roll. As a advanced sports dietitian, I take an evidence-based approach. And then having something like a gel or some blocks or something potentially right before you get in for your swim warm-up would be a last sort of a chance to get some fuel in as well. So all of those strategies are what I would go through with the client. It's very, I don't know, bespoke is another good word. Like it's customized to you and what your event is. So Wendy said, thanks. What I would do for Olympic distance, Wendy, is different to what I would do with you, Lisa, for a 70.3. Lisa said, thank you. You're welcome. So I hope that's helped, guys. I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to try and wrap up unless there's any last questions on Facebook or the gram, but it has been fun. Thank you for joining me, and good luck to anyone that's doing Cairns 70.3 or Ironman over the weekend. Super, super excited for all of you guys. I've already got pre-race nerves for you. And one final thing, if you're a triathlete, there's a bunch online at the moment. I've created a triathlon nutrition checklist. It's on the website. If you go to dietitianapproved.com.au, I can't even say my own website. I definitely need another coffee. Thanks, Steph. Dietitianapproved.com.au. Have a look on the homepage, scroll down a couple, and you'll see the triathlon nutrition checklist. That is a really great checklist of 50 things to check where you're kind of at with your nutrition for triathlon. So you can say yes or no to a bunch of things and go, yep, I do that, I'm nailing that, or no, I'm not doing that. I might need to step up my game in that space. So definitely jump on and grab that if you're a triathlete and you're online or you're watching the replay later, and check that out. So it's 50 things that help you with triathlon nutrition mastery. So I created that free. I'll send that out a bit later too. But for anyone that's online and wants to grab that, jump onto the website now. All right, no final questions. Thank you for joining me, guys. And I will see you next week.